If you're looking to better understand the shifting trade relations between the United States, Canada, and China, then this interview is for you. In Canada and the US, we're surrounded by Western narratives. It's all we hear. But context matters. Trade wars, tariffs, and global power struggles don't just happen in a vacuum. Tonight, we're stepping just outside the noise. I've layered this episode into 8 segments following the order that helps you best understand. Now, I don't know about you, but I am genuinely honored to be joined by Professor Lin, former chief economist and senior vice president of the World Bank during the critical years of 2008 to 2012, and China's State Councillor since 2013. Oh, and by the way, he's at Peking University as the Dean of Economics there as well. He's authored major works on China's economy and even predicted its rise over 4 decades ago. Tonight, he brings a different perspective you won't often hear. Professor Lin, thank you so much for making the time to join me. We're 12 hours apart right now.
Well, it's my great honor and pleasure.
Thank you.
This conversation, especially at a very important time for your country, for my country, and for the world, about the trade, about the growth in China, with the US, with Canada. And I'll do my best to share my views, and hopefully it will help us to, understanding of the opportunity and the challenges, so we can, chart a better future for our countries.
Absolutely, absolutely. It certainly is it's a questionable time, and I think what I see is my generation. I'm 21 years old. Is just a lack of information, a lack of conversation. And I'm so thrilled and thankful that you've decided to have this conversation with me. In part saying that, you authored a book called Demystifying the Chinese Economy, which I read in preparation for this interview. And one of the things you mentioned in that book, that before the 17th century, China had the most advanced technology in the world. I mean, you even note that gunpowder, the magnetic compass, and paper and printing were all Chinese inventions and played a major role in Europe's rise just a few centuries after. Can I ask you, what was China doing so well during that period to lead global innovation in that 17th, 16th, 15th century?
Well, before the Industrial Revolution, the technological innovation were based on the experiences of craftsmen, of the farmers in their daily life. And the chance to have a technology innovation certainly is very small, because those kind of technological innovation is experience-based. Workers, farmers, during the production process, all of a sudden, incidentally, they found out a better way, and that became new technology. And that was the approach, that was the mechanism for technological innovation before the Industrial Revolution. China had a large population, because the population size in China historically, has been about twice as large as people in Europe and so on. And since we have more people, certainly we have more talents, we have more experiences. And China had a more technological innovation. At that time, China led the world, development. But we know that after the Industrial Revolution, the technological innovation, the mechanism changed to experiment induced by science, by trial and error in laboratory. And by the new approach, you could do many experiments. And each experiment could represent the experiences of a farmer, of a craftsman for a lifetime. And so after the change to the new ways of technological innovation, the size of population does not matter. The most important thing that you need to have in a scientist, they do the experiment to find out a better technology and guided by scientists. China did not go to that new mechanism, and China lagged behind. And in fact, before the 18th century, technological innovation was so low So economic growth rate was so low at the time, and the income gap between the Western country or Eastern country or African countries were very small. At that time, actually, in terms of the incomes, the world was flat. But after Industrial Revolution, the productivity in those countries, engaged in Industrial Revolution, they all of a sudden jumped. For example, historical data indicate before 18th century, the annual growth rate of GDP in Western Europe was 0.05%. It took, 1,400 years to double the per capita GDP. Not what is the case in Europe, in China, in the world. China is a little bit ahead, but not much difference. But after the 18th century, after the Industrial Revolution, the rate of technological innovation in the industrialized country all of a sudden jumped 20 times, from 0.05% to 1%. And the GDP growth rate with 1%, that means per capita GDP growth rate 1%, that means every 70 years, the income of a person could double. In the past, it took 1,400 years. And after the Industrial Revolution, it reduced to 70 years. And then from mid-19th century to now, the advanced country, their per capita GDP growth rate further doubled from 1% to 2%. The time to double per capita GDP reduced down to 35%. And most other countries lag behind in this industrialization, in this new way of innovation. Certainly, we observe the so-called great divergence. Those industrial countries, they become industrialized, high-income, advanced country. Other countries lag behind. And China lost that opportunity. So China became lag behind after the 18th century. And now we are on the process of catching up.
Well, I think it's so important that you touch on that, and I appreciate that because context does matter, and that is arguably the most important thing to understand because we can't just, we're doing a missed job here in this interview if we just talk about China over the last, 40, 50 years. That's not what we're here to do because there's so much history, especially with just the Asian culture, so much greater than just Western culture as well that we do need to touch on. One of the things I wanted to ask you here in some of my questions, you propose that when technology becomes very advanced, which is something that's fascinating to me, you almost have this technological curve where a country can just continue to advance its technology, but then it caps and bottlenecks at a certain point. One of the things I was just curious to know is it even possible for China, or any country for that matter, to maintain incredible technological innovation and really be the world dominant power in technological innovation for more than a few hundred years? And we have about 30 seconds to answer this one.
Well, I think it's possible. But in terms of technological innovation, for countries on the global technological frontier, those advanced countries, if they want to have a technological innovation today, certainly they need to invent a new technology in the laboratory by experiment guided by sciences. And it's very expensive. They invest a lot. And as I mentioned, after the mid-19th century, the advanced country overall, they maintain about 2 percentage points in terms of improvement in the per capita GDP. That is the productivity is the foundation of income growth. But for a developing country after industrialization, there's a way called latecomers advantages. Now they have a technological gap with the one country, and they can learn, they can buy better machine from the one country to raise the productivities. They can license the technology from one country to improve their technology. That is also technology innovation for them, because the definition of innovation is to use better technology in your next period of time and compared to the technology you're using now. High-income country, they need to invent new technology because their technology is the best now. So if they want to have something new, they have to better. They need to invent. But for developing country, we can use the gap with the advanced country by learning, by borrowing, and so on. And if you can do that well, there are possibilities like China in the past 46 years.
Professor, I apologize. I have to cut you off here. We're going to cut to commercial, but we'll be right back for another segment discussing this even more in depth. Reform is a commonly used word, but it comes with some major public outcry in times. Citizens are typically concerned how the government goes about the transition of reform and how it will significantly impact their daily lives, because, of course, that's what citizens care about. And here to speak about this, obviously, in 1978, we saw massive reform from China around their economy. And so one of the things I wanted to touch on was the fact that in 1987, Professor, I found this really interesting when I was reading your book. When you returned to Beijing from studying in Chicago, you mentioned China was embarking on, they call it a globalization strategy, which basically encouraged sizable exports of processed products, meaning China would increase its processing of raw materials while promoting sizable imports of raw materials that they would get externally from other countries, processing imported material according to supplied samples, assembling supplied parts, and compensation trade. Let me ask you, in the reform, this was obviously a large part of the strategy. Why were these practices identified as a main focus in China's reform strategy? And then I have a follow-up for you after that, but just curious to hear your thoughts here, Professor.
Well, at a time, certainly, that is a good way for us to grow because we have abundant supply of labor force. And at that time, most of land, they work in low productivity agriculture. But if we want to grow, we need move up to higher productivity industrialized sectors. And our competitive advantage is in the labor-intensive type of technology and industries. And so if we want to move up to that industry, we need to have the technology, we have to make investment, but we did not have the technology, we did not have the capitals. And so we use this kind of approach to encourage foreign overseas firms to relocate their machinery and come to China and to employ the Chinese workers to produce and to export. And then when they export, they can use the revenues from export to pay the equipment and so on. That is the way that we started this globalization.
Now, can I just, Professor, do you mind if I ask you, you brought up how China succeeds really well in the labor-intensive activities. With the way that the world's going with AI innovation, does that pose a threat at all to China's labor-intensive industries? And how is China navigating that? Do they almost have to go through a new idea of reform with the way that they go about labor? Or are they innovating with these new technologies to stay competitive on a global market?
Well, at that time, we were very competitive because our labor cost is very low. And by that, we were competitive. We export a lot. And then we accumulate capitals. Then we can upgrade to new industry step by step. But after more than 40 years of rapid growth, gradually we turn from labor abundant country to capital abundant countries. And then we move up to more capital-intensive technologies. And gradually, some of our industries already reach the global technological frontiers. We need to do additional innovations. At the same time, the fourth industrial revolution gives us new opportunity. Because for the fourth industrial revolution, in the AI and so on, they're new to everyone. And for this kind of invention or innovation in the AIs, the most important inputs is human capitals, talents. We have a large population. Certainly, we have a large pool of talents. So now we can compete in this AI and so on. And you can see now China is quite innovative in areas.
Now, one of the questions I had for you, just around some of the reform, but also some of the challenges that China had around that. One of the things that I was doing was looking at China's debt to GDP ratio, because that's something that was in the news here in Western culture. And I guess I'm just curious, with it being over 300%, how does China manage that? And does it pose a threat to China's incentivization from the government, the state, really, for research and development and for innovation at all, considering the debt to GDP ratio is so high? And what's your view on that?
But actually, debt to GDP ratio, if you look in the public debt, debt to GDP ratio is quite low in China, because the combined debt of local governments as well as the central government is around 60% of GDP. And most other advanced countries, their debt to GDP ratio is more than 100%. And then in Japan, now 260% of their GDP. That's public debt. And for us, private debt is higher, but that related to our financial, arrangement, because our financial sector is mainly dominated by bank. We are bank-based financial system. So when the firm make investment, they borrow from the bank to make investment. And there's a lot of good opportunities, certainly they borrow a lot. And you see that the private debt in the advanced country, they are lower because they are market-based. They raise funds in the stock market to make investment. But we, borrow capital from the bank to make investment. And by this, certainly our debt to GDP ratio will be higher.
Right.
But whether this is sustainable or not, very much depends on this kind of investment can bring you revenue and to pay back your debt. If the investment in the new sectors is competitive, you can have revenues, you will be profitable, certainly you can pay back to the debt. And so it's not a challenging issue.
Professor, I'm just curious too. One of the things, because about this conversation is about finding solutions, and what it's wild that we're on two opposite sides of the world right now, because we can talk about some of the things that we hear from both our ends. And one of the things we hear here in North America is how China has used their dollar, their yen, to hold global competitiveness. And one of the thoughts here in the West is that it poses an unfair advantage that the yen is so low compared to rest of the world's currencies, and China subsidizes a lot from the government to boost innovation and research and development. What does China, or at least you, I know you can't represent all of China, but what do you say to something like that when we're making that claim here in the West?
That certainly is a rhetoric there, but it's not sustained by facts. Because if you can look at our trade, we export a lot, but we also import a lot. And our trade surplus is only about 1 percentage point or 2 percentage points of our GDP. And so the trade is basically balanced. And so if you say we manipulate our currency to do the export, then we will have not ability to import. You're going to see huge trade surplus, but we did not see that. So that means actually the value of our currency is basically, determined by the earning in the export and also the demand to use a foreign currency to import. So it's determined by demand and the supply of the foreign currencies. So it's a basic balances.
Do you see,
And
absolutely.
Hmm.
Do you see it as an advantage that the yen is significantly lower and holds a significantly lower value than the US currency, the Canadian currency, the European currency, in order to have a strong export market? Do you see that as a advantage? We have about 1 minute here before we have to cut to commercial.
We cannot manage that. If you try to do that, then there's a lot of opportunity for, arbitrage. But we do not see those kind of arbitrage, because if we lower the currency to increase the export to the U.S., and then we raise the currency to enable us to import from Europe or other country, then it will open up too much opportunity for arbitration, for arbitrage there. But we did not see that happen.
Interesting. So it's you've got some of the ebbs and flows. We only have about 30 seconds here, and I don't feel it's respectful to ask you the follow-up question that I have. But we'll be right back to discuss this a little bit more in depth. I have some more of the challenges here, and you're doing a great job at answering them. You know your stuff very well. One of the questions just to think about over the commercial is, I did notice China's per capita debt to GDP, import is lower than the United States and Canada. So I want to ask you about that just when we come back from commercial and give you a moment to think about it. Thank you. We'll be right back. So we're back with Professor Lin in arguably one of my favorite interviews we've ever done. I'm so honored to have him. Professor, one of the questions that I left you with after the commercial, we were talking about imports, exports. Then we were also talking about the yen as well. My question to you is, just upon the research that I was doing, I noticed that the per capita import value of Chinese citizens versus like the US and Canada is significantly lower. And so when we see, President Trump or Canada hasn't really addressed this, but when we see Western society come out and say, the trade deficit's so large, is there any value in what they have to say? Because I also understand the flip side of that too, is that you as a country bring so much value to us at such a lower price that allows us growth and innovation as well. So I'm just curious to get your thoughts on that as it relates to per capita imports.
Well, our per capita import certainly is lower than the US, than the Canada, because our per capita GDP is much lower. Currently, our per capita GDP is only about $13,400 US dollars. And certainly, we cannot import as much per capita wise as the US, because the per capita GDP is 85,000 US dollars.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Only 6 times of us. And if we want to import as much as the US, how much money we need to borrow? And can that be sustained? So certainly it's not. And what we need to look at that, we export about 16% of our GDP. We import about 14% to 15% of our GDP. And that is basically about 30% of our GDP is involved in the trade, either export or import. And basically that's balanced. If you ask us to borrow per capita as high as US, that means our per capita GDP or our production per person in China is around 13,000. And if we want to import, let's say 13,000, we want to import, let's say 35,000. It's impossible, right? Because our income is limited.
Right, right. And that was actually, I'm glad you kind of went this direction as well, because one of the follow-up questions I had for you was around, and we've heard this actually on the news here from interviews with individuals like economists in China as well, the idea of increasing domestic trade to offset the reliance of U.S. and let's say Canadian imports, or maybe even European imports. You talk about in your book the ratio, and it's funny because they had doubted you, and of course, a few decades later, you were correct in the ratio that it could be about 25% reliance on the U.S., as I understand, but then now it's around 67%, as when you wrote your book about, I want to say 10, 12 years ago. When we talk about that, do you see the reliance for income coming from other countries importing your goods as a concern on a level for the state because they're so reliant on other countries importing goods? Especially now we've seen President Trump place these tariffs, and now we have an ugly trade war. What are the challenges with increasing domestic trade? Does that need to happen in China? And I have a few follow-up questions there as well, but curious to get your thoughts.
Well, for the issue in the U.S. is that they have huge trade deficit. That's true, but only because they consume too much, right? And they cannot produce enough for themselves. Certainly, they need to import. But the reason they can consume so much is because U.S. dollar is global reserve currency. They can print the money to buy goods from other countries. But for other countries, including Canada and our own, if we want to increase, if we want to, unless you produce more, otherwise you cannot consume more, including those produced domestic or imported from domestic. That's one thing. And certainly now we see some trade deficit. And for China, we export something which we can offer at a cheaper cost than the U.S. can produce. That's good for the U.S. consumers. And there's something U.S. can produce that at a lower cost for us. And they want to buy, but U.S. want to prohibit those kind of product to be exported to China. That is the issue. For example, we like to buy more of the chips and for AI and so on, but it was prohibited. And that is the reason why the trade deficit in the US and China, is so high. Supposedly we have a then I'm sure the trade imbalance in China and the US will be narrowed. But
interesting. So you do see the ability, that was going to be one of my questions, the ability to narrow the trade deficit in some capacity. Obviously, now we have these trade wars and these tariffs going back and forth that are, I think we could both agree, unsustainable, and we need to find a way to merge those. My question to you was going to be around the idea of the United States being able to print money, which is, just to give you a little bit insight, we talk about that a lot here in Western culture, and we complain about it a lot, is that we print money and we use that to buy goods from other countries. Warren Buffett put it in a memo he wrote, a report, and I believe it was 2003, I want to say, about how if we kept doing that, other countries will buy up our debt and basically hold us and hold leverage on us because they own so much debt. And that was going to be one of my questions to you, is China they're the second largest holder of U.S. national debt. And of course, they own other forms of debt as well in the United States. Why? People here don't understand that. And I understand, being a Federal Reserve currency, the USD, it makes sense for China to be able to do that. But does that provide any leverage to China when trade wars like this occur, when they own that much of one country's debt?
Well, when we have trade surplus, when we current account surplus, that means we earn, some US dollars. And for US dollars, certainly we need to make investment globally. Certainly we buy the US government bond because that is a way for us to, invest our reserves. And certainly we also make investment in other countries But US dollar is one of the safe currencies that we can invest our money.
Right. Let me ask you this. We've seen China looking to invest more into European currencies because of what's happening with the United States. Is there a world in which China shifts heavy relations to Canada, where we've seen Canada and China almost spark up talks again about trying to build a better relationship, and then also Europe and China as well? People here have been talking about, oh, China's buying up a lot of euro currency because the perceived value of the USD as a Federal Reserve currency, the confidence is getting lower and lower with what's happening. Where do you see China's relationship with other countries evolving in this regard, like Canada, as I am here, and buying up other forms of countries' currencies and debt? Do you see that changing at all, or will China and U.S. maintain this current relationship?
I think certainly there's some kind of diversification in our reserve holding, but basically you need to, reserve holding for several purpose to preserve the value of the reserve. And secondly, you also need to use the reserve to facilitate your trade. So very much depends on, certainly US is the most important global trading currencies. You want to buy goods from other countries, very often we also need to pay US dollars. So we need to have reserve for that. We also import from European country, so we also have some reserve in Europe in euros. And our trade with Canada certainly, but Canadian dollar is not a global trade in dollars. If you want to buy goods from Canada, very often we have to pay US dollars. And that's the reason why we hold US dollar instead of Canadian dollars.
That's really interesting, and I appreciate you saying that. My last question to you is around population growth in China. China's population is projected to shrink. I mean, these are the 50% in the next century. I don't know how accurate that is, and you can only, you can't guarantee that. But the ratio of workers to retirees, it will decline if this is correct. How will that impact China's GDP growth and its position relative to the United States in the global economy as that affects, workers and pensions and whatever else you may have?
Well, that is related to the so-called aging issue. Yes, now we are entered into the aging stage. I'ma rule the world, I'ma rule the world, yeah. I'ma rule the world, I'ma rule the world, yeah.
Professor, as we close off with 10 minutes left here, I wanted to quickly discuss the currency idea just a little bit more in depth with what you brought up in your book, and then we'll get to some of the future of Canada, U.S., and China relations. Now, you mentioned in your book how China helped stabilize East Asian countries during the East Asian financial crisis. Let me ask you about maintaining a stronger yen to pose a threat. So because I was curious, did the devaluing of the currencies in the East Asian financial crisis, where China's currency was higher than other Asian countries around them, did that pose a threat at all to trade between those countries and China losing competitiveness on a global stage if those other countries in Asia held a lower dollar than the yen?
Well, that's during the East Asian financial crisis, because other crisis hit countries, they devalue and put their output more competitive internationally. At that time, China did not devalue to offset that. China maintained the currency exchange rate, but because those countries were hit by crisis, and so although their currency value was low, but they cannot deliver good timely, and so international buyers did not have the confidence to put order in those countries. Although our currency was higher, but our supply was reliable, and as a result, we are not hit so much by maintaining the high value.
Okay, interesting. Now, I get my follow-up to that too would be, I did draw some parallels with that situation in which China, helped the other Asian countries around them get their dollar value back up, because otherwise they would have, well, we don't know what would have happened, but it wouldn't have been good for the other countries in Asia. Is it fair for the United States to be saying that? Because I draw some parallels to that today, where the United States is now saying, oh, well, the yen is so much lower than the USD. We lose manufacturing power, which, loses jobs. We saw the China shock. That's what they call it in the States, where the United States lost a lot of jobs, millions of jobs to China because they lost manufacturing power due to a low currency, cheaper labor. Do you see any parallels with that, or how does that differ?
Well, I think, you cannot to use that as a reference because there's something in common. The shock from the trade policy in the years becomes something very unpredictable. And in the market, people do not like uncertainties. As I mentioned, if you want to use one lesson from the East Asian financial crisis, that although our currency value was higher and our good will become more expensive, but we can deliver the good according to the plan. We can deliver the good timely without interruption. But for those crisis hit countries, although their good could be could have lower prices, but you cannot guarantee they can deliver the good timely. And as you know, in your market, goods arrive before Christmas and the good arrive after Christmas. The price will be very different, right?
Right.
And also for the traders in the US or in other countries, they like to see the good can be shipped to their market timely according to the schedule. And that gives the China competitiveness at that time. And for this time, this shock was man-made. And of course, so much uncertainty because one day they charge 25% of tariff on your country. On the other day, they say, wow, this kind will be exempt for 90 days, but no one knows after 90 days what will be the situation. So there were too many uncertainties.
Interesting.
And so if we want to strengthen, we like to have rule-based trading system.
Right.
So we can have a confidence on our contract, on our productions, on our delivery, and so on. That will be good for every country.
Right. One of the questions I had for you was around Canada. And, as small as a country as we are, we do have a lot of value here as well. And so I wanted to discuss this with you too. Canada has close relationship with the United States. We saw Canada place a 100% tariff on EVs made in China. And we saw China slap back agricultural tariffs upwards of $2.63 billion about a month ago. I did an episode on that. My question to you is, how does the U.S. and China relationship affect China's relationship with Canada, considering Canada is so tight to the United States? Could we be treated the same way economically with tariffs? It seems like we've kept it pretty kosher with China. Do you see that relationship economically strengthening at all? And I don't ask you to project too much or speculate, but I am curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, from what I see, our economy is very complementary to your economy. What we are good at, like EV and so on, you cannot produce that at competitive prices in China. So for your consumer, it would be better to have a free trade arrangement so we can export EVs to Canada. But at the same time, you have many goods, we cannot produce domestically. Or if we want to produce domestically, we have to pay much higher prices. And
in China or in Canada? Is that in China or in Canada? Oh, in Canada.
Yeah, you have many goods that we import from Canada.
Right.
And so free trade is a win-win for every country.
Interesting. Let me ask you this. We have about 3.5 minutes here. I do have a question for you about the United States, but Canada just elected Mark Carney, Prime Minister Mark Carney, as their Prime Minister. If you had any advice for how the next Canadian Prime Minister should deal with China on an economic level, what would you say in just 30 seconds? What advice would you give to Mr. Carney, Prime Minister Carney?
You should make a policy based on what would be the best for Canada. You should not make a policy based on what is the best for the U.S.
Interesting. Thank you for saying that. I appreciate that a lot. One of the questions I had for you around the future of U.S. and China relations, do you see this as an end to hyperglobalization?
Well, I embrace globalization, and certainly now there's some kind of voice to go against globalization. But I think globalization will give every country the best benefit overall. Certainly, globalization means you benefit from the globalization because you will be able to import goods which you are not good at, and you will have the more opportunity to export goods which you are good at. And at the end, everyone benefits from that. But in this process, certainly you need to make some adjustment. For example, if you used to produce, if you don't have a globalization, you are closed economy, produce everything for yourself. Then there are some sectors which you are not good at. You produce domestically, and now with the globalization, you import goods which at a much lower cost. In those sectors, they may lose. But you have sectors which, in the past, you are good at the production, but you cannot access the global market. Now you have access to the global markets, they expand. So some people benefit from the globalization. Some people may be hurt by the globalization. In this time, the government should have some policy to help the people in the losing sectors to retrain them so they can find job in the expanding sectors.
Right.
And at the same time, you also need to have some kind of social security to provide some support in this transition process. But overall, to the nation, globalization provides the best solution.
Let me ask you, we have 1 minute left here. Is a truly free trade agreement between the United States and China realistic? Or are there too many structural barriers? The United States talks about currency manipulation. And unfortunately, we don't have enough time to get into that. Or as well as, cheap labor costs, competing, taking jobs. That's everything that we hear here in Canada, United States. And, there's a lot to that. But is truly free trade something that just won't happen between the United States and China? You have 30 seconds.
If we make policy for the benefit of the people, certainly we should be able to have free trade because that's good for China. That's also good for the U.S.
Professor, I cannot thank you enough. This has been incredible. And I really, really hope that upon your arrival back from your travels, we can sit down again. I will definitely be reaching out. But thank you so much.
Thank you very much for this opportunity for the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll end off with this. Do not simply accept what you are told. Challenge your thinking, engage in differences, and listen to new perspectives. Thank you, and have a great night. I'ma rule the world, yeah.